Well, I am excited about continuing our series through Exodus this morning. We kicked this off a few weeks ago, a 9-part series walking through Exodus leading into Easter and even a few weeks beyond Easter. And it's a study that we are very intentionally looking at going into and out of Easter, because the story of Exodus, as we keep mentioning, is not just a 3,000-year-old story. It's actually our story. The Exodus story is our story. And just a real quick review about why we are studying this. What we've seen each week, and I mentioned to you the first week when I kind of did a great big overview of Exodus, is that one of the things we see in Exodus, what God is doing, is that Exodus is simply the story of God making himself known in a world where he has long been forgotten. You might remember that Exodus kind of begins that a Pharaoh came to power that forgot Joseph and therefore forgot Joseph's God. And not only had Pharaoh forgotten Joseph's God, but honestly, so had the people of God. So had the Israelites, the Hebrew people. They weren't as familiar with who God was anymore. And so Exodus is the story of God making himself known, because 600 years earlier, God had made a promise to a guy named Abraham that his descendants would one day bless the world and would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And throughout Exodus, what we find is the people of God, not only is Egypt and Pharaoh, but also the people of God are continually forgetting God. Pharaoh forgets God, Egypt forgets God, but the people of God keep forgetting God over and over and over again. And so real quick, just a reminder of what I said we're going to see all the way through this series, that even though the people of God keep forgetting him, what we find in Exodus, why this is so important to us, is that we'll find over and over that God is faithful to keep his promises. Even when we are unfaithful, God remains faithful to keep his promise. But sometimes God will keep his promise in a way that is different than we imagined. His plan to keep his promise changes from what we might accept and believe, anticipate. God is always faithful. He's always going to fulfill his promise. Sometimes he's going to do it in a way that we do not expect. And when that happens, when things are happening to us and around us, and in us that we do not fully understand, when you don't understand what's happening, what we find in Exodus is that you can still always, always, always trust what God is doing. This is the story we're going to see over and over again play out in Exodus. And it's also the story we see play out in our lives, which is why it's so important that we jump into this going into Easter. Now, with that being said, let me ask you, have you ever been asked to do something that was outside of your ability to do when you were asked to do it? That ever happened to anybody in here? Like somebody asked you to do something, I don't know how to do that. I grew up here in Lake County, graduated from Leesburg High School a couple of years ago. It's not that funny, but it's a minute or two. But, I grew up here, and one of the things we did growing up is I grew up on the lakes. I love being on the water. I grew up fishing with my grandfather, or skiing, or kneeboarding back in the day. Y'all remember when that was the thing, kneeboarding, right? And we actually tubed back in the day with real tubes, not this kind of cheap kind of for baby stuff where you got an actual chair you got to sit in, right? I mean, it was an actual like semi-inner tube. You take a rope to your boat. I mean, that was real tubing back in the day, y'all, all right? I may bring that back. I don't know. Anyway, I love the water. Always have, skiing, kneeboarding. Today it's wakeboarding, surfing, all that kind of stuff. And so as a result, I grew up on the Harris chain of lakes. My grandmother lived on Lake Conway in Orlando. It was always around it. And I love seeing people get into boating, maybe even for the first time. I think it's great. It's a lot of fun. And I always enjoy watching people, experience that. But one of the things I found that people don't necessarily take into account when they buy their first boat is something called trailering. Just because you own a boat doesn't mean you know how to drive the boat, but it also doesn't mean you know how to back that boat on the trailer down the boat ramp into the water. You know what I'm saying? Anybody like to people watch? So if you ever are looking for just a good, enjoyable time, go down to the Claremont boat ramp on a Saturday in July. Like, you'll see some good entertainment right there. Last summer, we were pulling our boat out of the water and waiting on this family that apparently had bought 2 new jet skis, first time they'd ever had them, and they'd been out as a family, a mom and a dad and 2 teenage boys, and they were coming at the end of the day and loading them up, and Dad sends Mom to get the truck and back the trailer in the boat ramp, and Mom apparently has never done this before, and if you're not used to backing trailers, you might not know this, that actually backing a small trailer is much more difficult than a large trailer because it will jackknife very quickly. And so Mom pulls up and starts to back up, and she immediately jackknifes the trailer, and she pulls forward and does it again, does it like 7 or 8 times. They can't get the trailer down the ramp. So finally, her 2 teenage boys, they come up with a brilliant plan. They run up, The mom backs it down. She jackknifes the trailer. They holler to stop. They pick it up, move it, straighten it up. She backs it down, jackknifes it again. They stop, pick it up, straighten it up 10 times down into the boat ramp. And finally, Dad's yelling at her, can't you just back it straight? And she gets out of the truck and slams the door. You do it. And I guess walks home. She just took off walking down East Avenue, right? If you've ever been asked to do something that you do not have the ability to do, it can be intimidating. I remember 25 years ago, I was in a meeting that the opportunity to start this church was presented. And would you pray about that and see if you feel God calling you to do that? And I go home from this meeting to tell my wife, hey, they asked me to be the founding, planting pastor of a new church in Claremont. And her response was, why you? And she wasn't just being harsh. It was a legit question. I was 25 years old. I knew nothing about starting a church. Like, why me? I don't know. I got a lot of questions, all right? When you are asked to do something that's outside of your ability to do it, it can be pretty intimidating. And so I say all that just to say this. I want you to consider where Moses is in his life at this point in the Exodus story, all right? Because he's about to be asked to do something that is absolutely beyond his ability to do. God is sending Moses before Pharaoh, who at this point in history is the most powerful ruler of the most powerful and wealthiest nation in the world. That's what Egypt is at this point in time. And they have enslaved the Hebrew people as their workforce, a group of people that originated from one of their old rulers who was put in a position of power, a guy named Joseph, right? A descendant of a guy named Abraham, and he blessed Egypt, and Egypt prospered under the leadership of Joseph, and Joseph's family grew and prospered and did very, very well. But Moses is born now at a time when the Hebrews are not enjoyed and they're not blessed and looked highly on. They're actually enslaved and feared because their numbers are so great. And so Moses is born a Hebrew at a time when Pharaoh has decreed that all Hebrew boys should be put to death so that their numbers do not continue to increase. Only he's rescued from that. He's raised as an Egyptian, the son of Pharaoh's daughter, who eventually, in his later years, kills an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew. He flees Egypt out of fear and has spent the next 40 years as a shepherd working for his father-in-law. And so 80 years old, Moses is being sent by God back to Egypt for the sole purpose of demanding. Okay, not asking, not requesting, not negotiating, not hoping. He's sent back to demand before Pharaoh that Pharaoh release the Hebrew people, his slave workforce of more than 1 million people. Because that's going to go well, right? You want to talk about intimidating. And I feel like we give Moses a lot of grief for all the excuses he rattles off in chapter 3. God, how am I going to do this? What if they don't listen to me? What if they don't believe me? What if they ask me who you are? I can't talk very well. All these excuses Moses gives, and we kind of throw him under the bus for it, but the fact is they're absolutely legitimate questions. They're questions you'd have, I'd have, concerns we'd all would have and ask. In fact, Robert made the point last Sunday, if you were here, that the only two tools that God gives Moses on this journey to appear before Pharaoh and demand the release of the people, he gives him two things, a shepherd's staff and a voice. And a voice that's not even his voice. It's his younger brother Aaron's voice, okay? I mean, you got to be thinking that Moses had to be a little bit nervous about that. Like, my younger brother is going to speak for me. Anybody in here have anyone in your family that you get a little nervous when they start talking? Like, you never know what's going to come out of their mouth? You have that? Like, before you bring a friend over for Christmas dinner or whatever, you got to warn them, look, my Aunt Billy's going to be there, and Aunt Susie's going to be there. They're just a little bit crazy, right? You never know what they're going to say. And so you got to think, like, Moses was a little bit nervous about all that. Because, you know, I'm going to tell you what to say. What are the chances that my younger brother is going to say to Pharaoh exactly what I tell my younger brother to say? Anybody ever misquoted you? That never happens to me as a pastor. You ever played the telephone game? Remember that kind of? I think that's what it was called. At least it was, I don't know what they call it now. You don't really have telephone. It's the cell phone game, I guess. I don't know, but you know, you put people in a circle and you whisper a phrase into somebody's ear. They whisper that phrase, and you go around the circle and you're trying to see if what the last person hears is anything remotely close to what the first person says, and it never is, right? Like the original phrase was like Tom Sawyer liked to fish in the Mississippi River. And what the last person heard was, Brian Hammond's a better musician than Stephen Cardwell, or something like that, right? Which is true, but, you know, I mean, it's not what was said. And so Moses got to be a little bit worried, like he's going to tell his younger brother, say this to Pharaoh, tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And his younger brother's going to be like, hey, Pharaoh, my younger brother said, you don't let these people go, God's going to slap that grin off your face. That is not what I said, Pharaoh. Right? There's got to be a little bit of fear going on with this. The only thing he gives him is a staff and a voice that's not even his. And what I want to look at today is, as we look at this story, I want us to look at what happens when we are faithful to serve God, but the outcome of serving God is very different than we imagined it would be. Maybe the immediate outcome you can't even call good. Maybe in the early days or these steps, and as you're following God, it doesn't get easy, it gets harder. I want to look at the response that happens when things go differently than we planned, at least initially. So let's jump into this. Exodus chapter 5, start with verse 1. It says this, that Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh. Okay, so Moses and Aaron, they are accepting the challenge. Robert talked about this the last couple of Sundays. They're accepting the call to leave where they are and to go and on this mission and pursue this plan that God has before them. And again, there's almost certainly a large amount of hesitation. We know there is. Moses has shared a lot of his hesitations with God. That's recorded in Exodus. But then again, when God starts talking to you from a shrub that's burning on fire but not burning up, eventually you're like, maybe we should just listen and go. And so they do, right? They leave and they go to Egypt. And here's what they say when they get before Pharaoh. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. Now, over the next several verses, what I want us to pay close attention to is the response that the different people in this story have to God's plan. God's plan to keep his promise all the way back to Abraham is that he sends Moses to Pharaoh to deliver the people. And he says to Pharaoh, let my people go. That's his instruction to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, let my people go. And then he also has another instruction in this verse right here to the Israelites, because I want you to hold a feast to me. I want you to worship me. So Pharaoh, let my people go. My people, Israelites, Hebrews, worship me. All right? Have a feast to me, because I'm about to do something great. I'm about to do what you've asked. I'm about to fulfill my promise, albeit in a way that's a little bit different than you have planned and expected. I'm about to do this great thing, right? Now, the responses that we see to this, though, are varied. And we're specifically going to look at three different responses that three different people have. We're going to look at how Pharaoh responds to this. Then we're going to look at how the Israelites respond to this. And then we're going to see how Moses responds to this. And what we're going to find at the end is all of us in here, all of us watching, all of us listening to this, we've all had probably all of these responses to God at some point in our life. Again, this story is not just a 3,000-year-old story. It's our story. So let's start by looking at how Pharaoh responds when God says, let my people go. Here's what he says in verse 2. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. I would summarize Pharaoh's response to the Lord and to God's plan this way. Pharaoh basically says, who is the Lord and why should I care? Like, who is this God of yours? I don't know this God of yours. Who is he? And why should I care what he says? Why should I do what he says? I don't know him. You might know him. I don't know him. I'm not going to listen to him, and I'm certainly not going to do what he's told me to do. Who is the Lord and why should I listen? And not only does Pharaoh not listen to what the Lord says and release the nation of Israel, but he actually takes it one step further by going in the opposite direction even more. Look at verse 6. The same day, okay, this isn't a long time playing out. The same day that Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh, let my people go, God says, that they may worship me. The same day that Pharaoh says, no, I'm not doing that, he makes another decision. He says to the taskmasters, who are Egyptians that are tasked with controlling the nation of Israel, right? They are their supervisors, their taskmasters. They oppress them and lead them and control them. That's what the taskmaster is, Egyptians. So Pharaoh commands the taskmasters, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, but let them go and gather straw themselves. But the number of bricks that they made, you shall by no means reduce it. So Pharaoh's like, listen, I don't know your God, and I'm not going to listen to your God. Why do I care what your God has to say? And not only am I not going to listen and obey and release these people, I'm going to make it harder. If they got enough time to leave and to go worship some God that I've never heard of, you got time to work more. So here's what we're going to do. We used to provide the straw that you needed to make these bricks. We ain't doing that anymore. You go get it yourself. Go get the straw, but every day, the same number of bricks you used to make, I expect the same number to be made, even though you're doing more work. Now, that sounds like a way to win friends and influence people, right? Imagine if your boss came to you, we're not paying you anymore, we're not giving you any more time, but we're going to double your workload. You need to get the same amount done from there on out that you used to get done doing half the work. Like you're like, I believe I'm going to find a new job. Not really an option for them, right? So again, in other words, Pharaoh's response to God's request is not only ignored, but he places this burden that is even more difficult, and it doesn't stop there. In verse 14, he says this, the foreman of the people of Israel. Okay, so these are not Egyptians, these are Israelites. So you got the taskmasters that are Egyptians over the Israelite people, and those taskmasters set foremen who were Hebrews to kind of carry out their will on the people. The foremen of the people of Israel were beaten and were asked, why have you not done all of your task as in the past? Like, what is wrong with you all? You're not doing what you used to do. You're not accomplishing what you used to accomplish. We're going to inflict even more pain on you. We're going to beat you for that. They're beaten for not being able to fulfill an unrealistic demand. Now, listen, and I want you to hear this, all right? In some way, shape, or form, all of us have done this. Now, maybe not physically beaten someone. I mean, I hope not, right? But in some way, shape, or form, we have all responded to God the way that Pharaoh responded to God. Not only do I not know you, God, and I don't want to listen to you, God, and I'm not going to listen to you, God, but I'm going to dig in my heels obstinately and stay where I am, or maybe even worse, I'm going to go the opposite direction even harder. We've all done that. We've all acted that way. God, I don't want to listen. I don't want to respond. I don't want to obey. I don't want to pursue. No, I'm going to stay right here, or I'm going to just keep going the other way even more. We've all done that. We've all responded obstinately to God. Now, Pharaoh's response to God is what? Who is this God, and why should I care? Again, we've all been there. Or maybe today it's still where you are. Now, let's look next at the second response we have to God's plan of Pharaoh letting the people go and the people going into the wilderness to worship God. Let's look at what the people's response is to God's plan. So what we read as you go through chapter 5 is that the foremen of the Israelites, right, these Israelite leaders, they decide to take their case to Pharaoh. They take their case to Pharaoh like, look, these two guys showed up, and I know that what they demanded, but why are you making our job harder? You know, you're beating us because we can't do twice the work in the same amount of time. We just can't physically get it done. Let's see if we can negotiate something here. They make an appeal to Pharaoh to kind of go back to at least the way things were before Moses and Aaron show up. And here's Pharaoh's response to them. Pharaoh says to them, you are idle. That is why you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Like, you know why I'm making this harder on you? Because you're lazy. If you got time to go worship some God that I've never heard of in the wilderness, you got time to work more and do more. That's why I've given you more to do. If you've got all this time. And so basically he says, no, get back to work. I'm not going to change anything. We're not going back to the way things were. This is the way it is. I'm going to make your life harder from here on out. Get back to work. And here's what it says about the foremen when they leave Pharaoh. The foremen of the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble. Like, well, that didn't go the way we thought. And so they walk out of Pharaoh's court. And as they walk out of Pharaoh's court, Moses and Aaron are waiting for them because they know they've gone before Pharaoh. They know what's happened. And the foremen of Israel, they come out and they walk up to Moses and Aaron, and here's what happens in that interaction next. They look at Moses and Aaron, they say, the Lord look on you and judge you, Moses. And the Lord look on you and judge you because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and they've put a sword in their hands to kill us. The Israelites' response to the plan of God to deliver them, when their plan didn't turn out the way they imagined, was to blame Moses and to trust Pharaoh. Isn't it interesting sometimes when our life doesn't turn out the way we thought, we actually run back to the very thing we prayed for God to deliver us from? They've been praying to be delivered. God sends someone to deliver. It doesn't work out the way they thought. It doesn't happen the way they thought. In fact, it gets harder before it gets better. And their immediate response is to blame Moses. Moses, this is your fault. And we didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for you to do this. Everything that's happening is your fault because your demands of God to Pharaoh have made our life harder. And if that is what God truly wants, then we don't want that, and we don't want him, and we don't want you. Now listen, if that's not human nature, I don't know what is. And guys, our society has perfected that. The art of blaming someone else or something else for what's not right in my life. It's always somebody else's fault, and we always got to find somebody to blame. Let me point the finger here and there, and it's their fault, his fault, her fault. Republicans' fault, Democrats' fault. Let's blame Disney. Why not? I mean, let's just blame everybody we can think of. It's got to be somebody else's fault. We are so quick to point and to blame. We've all done it. And sometimes when our life doesn't go exactly the way we hoped, oftentimes, you know who else we find ourselves easy to blame? God. We find ourselves blaming God. God, if you really loved, if you really cared, if you really were. Again, if you remember how Exodus began, it begins with a Pharaoh rising up that doesn't remember Joseph and doesn't remember Joseph's God and begins to deal harshly with the Israelite people. And they cry out to God for help. But when God's plan for offering that help and keeping his promise is different than they imagine, their immediate quick response is to blame God and to blame the man that God sent and to trust Pharaoh instead, the very one that they were crying out at the beginning of this story to be delivered from. Again, we've all been there. We've all done that. Exodus story, it's our story. But there's one final response to God's plan and purpose that's listed in this chapter that's really important to look at, and that is the response that Moses has. Moses, when he stands before the people and he's accused by the people that it's his fault things are going bad with him, do you know what Moses' response is? Moses, he doesn't blame God. He doesn't trust Pharaoh. He actually turns to God, but he questions God. And he questions God pretty harshly and pretty directly. In fact, verse 22, here's how Moses responds. Then Moses turned to the Lord and he said, "O Lord, why have you? Why have you done evil to this people? And why did you ever send me here at all?" Like, why, God, did you send me here? Why did you show up here? Because since the moment I came to Pharaoh, you know what's not changed? I've not stopped speaking your name to Pharaoh, and he's not stopped doing evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. Moses isn't mincing words with God right here. Like, God, you sent me here, and I knew it would be hard. And I don't think that Moses would have expected the moment he showed up and he said for the first time, "Hey, Pharaoh, let the people go." And Pharaoh would be like, "What? Sure." Like, I don't think he expected it to happen that fast. But I also do not think he expected Pharaoh to make their life harder and for God to seemingly do nothing at all. Side note, you ever been in a moment in your life that you felt like God was doing nothing at all? Like, God, you're incredibly quiet. You seem really absent. Since I said yes to you and I've been following you and I've tried to be faithful, all I know is that you've not delivered anything and you've not really done what you said you were going to do. Now, here's what I hope you see from this today. Think about these three reactions to God's plan for fulfilling his promise. Let my people go, that they should go in the wilderness, have a feast to me and worship me. Pharaoh's response, who is God and why should I care? The Israelites' response, to blame Moses and trust Pharaoh. Moses' response, turn to God but question him. Here's what I want you to see from today. The truth about all of us in this room, all of us watching, all of us listening to this. When God's plan in our life doesn't turn out the way we thought it would or should, when we don't understand what is happening around us, here's what we all find ourselves a tendency to do. We are all very quick to question God. I mean, aren't we? Can we just be honest? How about this? I am. Probably not proud of it, but I am. God, what in the world? God, why? How could you? Why didn't you? Why did you? Why won't you? Why haven't you? I mean, I got all kinds of questions. We're very quick to question God. And I'll even say, I don't think that's a bad thing, and I'll get there in just a minute, but we're very quick to question God. But in our quickness to question God, you know what else we are? We're often very unwilling to do the hard work to find the answer. God, why? Why in the world? And then we're just on our merry way. Because finding the answer, finding what's true, finding out who God is, you know what it does take? It takes some work. Being faithful to God when you don't understand, it takes some work. Making sense of things that don't make sense, it takes some work. And we're really quick to question, and by question I would also say even blame God. And I would tell you, go for it. There's not a question, by the way, you'll ever ask God that God's not big enough to handle. You're clear on that? But if you're going to be big enough to question God, I would charge you to also be willing and big enough to do the hard work to wrestle through the answer that might even be an answer you don't want to hear. And here's what you need to understand. When we leave it here, this is why this can be so damaging to our faith. Not asking the question. Asking a question of God is never a dangerous thing. It's never going to hurt your faith. I'm convinced of that. I'll argue that point with anybody. Bible is filled with people that walked with God much deeper than any of us in this room, like in a physical way, and had deep questions for God, right? Questioning God is never the wrong thing. God, I don't understand. Tell him. But when you're willing to question but unwilling to do the hard work to find the answer, here's why that's so dangerous. Because in this moment, when you leave it there, you have given the question of our ignorance more authority over your life than the hope that comes from the truth. When I'm willing to say, God, I don't understand, why did you? And then I'm just going to walk out the door and not really wrestle through the truth. I have in that moment chosen to give my ignorance of who God is, my ignorance of the plan of God, my ignorance about the question that I have, I've allowed that more authority. I've allowed it to rule. I've allowed it to govern, to lead, to dictate, and to shape my faith rather than the hope that I have when I do the hard work of understanding the truth of who God is. And I don't know about you, but I, for one, am not willing to give the ignorance of my life any more leeway than it's already had. Like my ignorance has created enough chaos in my life. Why in the world do I want to live there? And you know, there are never-ending questions that we have when we don't understand what's happening. And again, I get it. I've had them for me personally. For 25 years, I've been the pastor of this church this November. I've stood with a lot of you in a lot of moments where I didn't have a whole lot of answers, and I had more questions than I had answers. I get all of that. And sometimes you cannot help but find yourself questioning God. And again, I want to say that's okay. Because there is nothing in the Bible that ever prohibits you from asking God that. There isn't. In fact, if anything, we have the opposite example. Adam questioned God. Abraham questioned God. Moses questioned God. David questioned God. Solomon questioned God. Elijah questioned God. Jeremiah questioned God. Jesus questioned God. Father, if there is any other way. But do you know what all of those people I just mentioned also did? They did the hard work of seeking the truth about the Father. They didn't leave it at their question. They did the hard work of seeking the truth of the Father. Jeremiah, in his lament in the Old Testament, he's got some pretty direct words for God. God, I feel like you have shot an arrow through my heart. God, I feel like you have boxed me out. You've hemmed me into this turmoil and pain and trouble. You won't listen to me. You've not received me. You've rejected me. Basically, is what he says in chapter 3, just this whole long lament. And then in the middle of it, he stops. He says, but nevertheless, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This morning, I got here really early. And usually I'll spend some time in my office just reading over things and praying, and got time for me to just kind of pray. And rather than in my office, I just decided to walk outside. It was early, sun wasn't up yet, and just walking down the sidewalk, and the sun's just kind of beginning to almost come above the horizon right there, and it was just this beautiful moment. And that verse in Lamentations just came to my mind. Your mercies are new every morning. Your mercies are new every morning. Today, right now, I'm experiencing your mercy in a brand new way, just like I did yesterday, and just like I will again tomorrow. Jesus asked the question, but he followed that question up by seeking the truth, didn't he? What else did he say? If there's any other way, but nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. You say, wait a minute, he's God. Yes, he's God, but he was fully man in that moment. And you see the spirit and the flesh and the battle that we all wrestle with embodied in Jesus. I trust you, Father, even though this is hard. It's a question, that's fine. Ask it. We all have them. But when you leave it there, this is what you're doing. When you don't choose to step into the hard work of finding what is true about God. And I know it's a harsh way to say it, but I didn't know any way to say it any better. When we are unwilling to do the hard work to discover the truth of who God is, we are giving our ignorance of God more authority over us than the hope that we find in his truth. All because we're unwilling to do the hard work to truly know the truth that sets you free. You know, I think we've been fed this bill of goods that isn't true. A lot of us anyway. That says following Jesus will be easy. Like follow Jesus, it'll be easy. Be faithful to Jesus, he'll bless your life beyond measure. Things will be happy and good and easy, free from trouble. Listen, I will say this, you follow Christ, you are blessed beyond measure. All right? There's no doubt about that. But you know what else Jesus said? Get ready, because in this world, you're going to have some trouble. And out of the 11 disciples that were left after Judas took his life, after Jesus is resurrected, out of those 11 that were left, you realize only one of them died of natural causes? 10 of them were martyred for their faith. The only one to die of natural causes was John, who died alone, exiled on the island of Patmos, after tradition says he was dipped alive into boiling oil and survived it. I think I'd rather been martyred than just been done. I don't think any of them would say following Jesus was easy. And sometimes, here's what I want you to get, friends. Sometimes the way of righteousness and godliness is downright hard. Sometimes it is the hardest thing you will ever do. Living for Christ, sometimes. It is the most challenging thing. It's the most convicting thing. It's the most undermining of my will and my desires and my whatevers. It sometimes is the most difficult thing you will ever do. Hebrews 11 writes about the faith of some of the greatest figures in the Bible. We call it the Great Hall of Faith, is kind of the nickname a lot of us give to it, right? It talks about people like Noah and Abraham and Jacob and Sarah and Moses and others. And it records how they trusted God and followed God and were obedient to God even when they didn't understand, and it was declared righteousness to them. But then it also says this about them in Hebrews 11, that they all died not having received the things promised, but saw them and greeted them from afar. In Hebrews 11, it talks about how some of them absolutely experienced the goodness and the blessing, and then it went the way that they thought, but there's a whole bunch of them that did not receive the things promised. They only saw them from a distance. God promised, and we see what God's doing, but it wasn't realized in our life. So does that mean that God was unfaithful? No. They only saw them and greeted them from afar. And you know what that means? It means that these people he talks about in Hebrews chapter 11 understood that sometimes God's plan is different than they imagined. And when it is, and they don't understand what was happening, that they could still trust what God was doing. That's what they learned. That's what they understood. That's how they lived. And so today I want to end things with a question and a statement that I really want us to consider. And I know this is it's a little direct, and it may even be a little heavy, but I want to ask this question, and I want to make a statement after it, and I hope you'll be willing to consider it. And the question I want to ask and have you ask yourselves is this: when it comes to my life and relationship with God, have I given my ignorance or God's truth the authority over my life? Like, friend, how would you answer that right now? Which has more authority over me right now in this moment? Which of these is shaping my life more? the ignorance of the things I don't understand, the ignorance of my own plans and desires and hopes and dreams? Or have I given the authority of my life truly to a God that is good and holy and righteous and just, that I know even when I don't understand, I can still trust? Because it's really easy to live here. I do it way more than I should, giving the authority of my life to the things I don't understand and suffer for it. But friend, truly today, what has more authority? Does the truth of who God is and that He is faithful to fulfill His promise, and that sometimes He'll do it in a way you don't understand, but you can still trust Him, does that truly have authority over you? Is that what shapes you? Is that what you're living under? Because the example we have in Exodus is when the Israelites gave the truth of who God is authority to lead them, it went far differently. It wasn't always easy, but it went far better than when they led it themselves. And out of this question, I want to make a statement, and before I do, I just want to qualify the statement I'm about to make this way. I realize that sometimes life doesn't turn out the way that you planned. Sometimes it doesn't go the way that you hope. And sometimes it never does. That's what Hebrews 11 said. And based on this question and based on what we see in Exodus, the statement I want to leave you with is this. I found this to be true in my life, and I hope you will embrace this. That if I never experience all that I hope in this life, following Christ faithfully is still worth it. If I never experience all that I hope, if God never does all that I ask, if it never is realized, if I only see it from afar, some things that I hoped to embrace and embody and to participate in, if I never see that and I only see it from afar, if I never experience all that I hope in this life, following Christ faithfully is still worth it. And I put faithfully down here for a reason, because there's a lot of people that follow Christ, just not faithfully. We follow Him at a distance. We follow Him partially. We follow Him casually. We follow Him occasionally. We follow Him a lot of different ways. But friends, following Him faithfully, it's still worth it. That's the example we see in Exodus from beginning to end, and not just to follow Him at a distance. The story of Exodus, this story is our story. It shows us that regardless of who we are, what we do not experience, God is faithful and He's worthy to be praised and followed and trusted, because in those moments, we can always still be assured that God is good. He's proven it time and time and time again. So I'm going to ask you to pray with me as we close this morning. Father God, I thank You for this truth. And God, I pray right now for those that might be here in this room or watching this message that are in that season, in that moment where there is something or many things that has not turned out the way that they planned. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of baggage and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of doubt. God, first encourage them. Remind them that it's okay to ask You the tough stuff. But God, remind them through the story of Exodus, through Moses and the Israelites and Pharaoh and all that we see in there, that even when we don't understand You, we can still trust You. That following You is worth it, no matter what. Whether You take longer to do what we've asked than we thought, or whether we never experience what we hoped for in the way that we thought and only see it from a distance, God, You are faithful. And You are worthy to be followed and trusted and praised, and we give You our life. God, I pray that we as Your people, as a church, would be willing to follow You faithfully today and every day. We love You, God. In Jesus' name, amen.